Hey now, my name is Nick, this is Board Game Brawl, and today we're going to take a look at a game that is currently seeking funding on Kickstarter. That game is Tyrannus, Game of the Gods from designer Thane Morgan. Now if you like what you see throughout the course of this video, I'm going to have links at the bottom of the screen and then down in the comment description that will take you to the Kickstarter project page. You can find out more information there and hopefully consider pledging to the project. Now what is Tyrannus? This is a competitive game for 2 to 4 players. Each player takes control of a god and you're all pulling your resources together in order to build the world. But then you're going to try to colonize it with all of your different tribes that are loyal to you, build temples with them, and then of course go to war with all of the other tribes and temples of your rival gods, using heroes and monsters to try and defile those temples and bring the world to heel under your control. All of that takes place over 4 distinct phases during the game, made up of several turns, each phase leading into the other one, and each phase having an impact on all of the following phases. So let's go ahead and take a brief overview of how the game is played, then we're going to come back and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, I'm going to give you a very brief run through of Tyrannus, the Game of Gods. Now, a few quick notes I want to say right up front. First, this game is currently seeking funding on Kickstarter, so if you're interested in what you see here and what you saw in my intro and my outro, then you can go to the link at the bottom of your screen and also down in the comment description below this video, and that will take you directly to the Kickstarter project page for Tyrannus. You can find out more information about the game and consider pledging to the campaign. The second thing I'll say is that this is only a prototype version of the game. When the game funds, you can expect that the final version will look different. There's going to be different types of components, perhaps different artwork, even some gameplay elements might change, so please bear that in mind as we go through the rest of the overview. And the last thing I'm going to say, I promise, before we begin, is just that, like I said, I'm only going to do a general overview of how the game is played from phase to phase. If you want to know more about the rules and some of the little nuances and how scoring works, things like that, I urge you to check out the videos that the designer is going to have on the Kickstarter page explaining the game more in depth. Okay, so what is Tyrannus? This is a competitive game for 2 to 4 players. Each of the players takes control of a god, and you are forging the world and trying to make it into your own image, which means essentially conquering it and filling it with your followers as opposed to the followers of the other gods. The game is broken down into 4 phases. Phase 1 is creation, where the gods actually build the world out on the table. And I assure you that we'll need more space in the small space I have between the player mats. As we build the world out, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Phase 2 is population. We've built the world, and now we need to populate it with our followers and try to crowd out the followers of the other gods. That leads to Phase 3, which is construction. The followers that are already out on the map are going to try and build temples in your honor, the honor of the god that you're playing as. And Phase 4 is war. This is where you take your monsters and heroes and try to defile the temples of the other gods, and in that way dominate the world. Now first, a quick explanation of the different components. These are scoring markers over here. You use these to keep track of your score. Ultimately, the goal of the game is to have the highest score by the end, and you're going to score at the end of every phase and during each of the phases as well. Keep track of that, and then at the end of the game, you'll add up all of your scores together. Whoever has the most points is going to be the winner, and during the course of the game, you'll use these and a pen and paper in order to keep track of those scores. Now, each player also has a set of player pieces, and these are what you're going to be using during the course of the game to signify your domination of the world. The most plentiful of them are these tribal token markers. Now, actually, the most important thing I should say about all of these different pieces is that during the course of the game, they may be used for different things. Like the tribal tokens may be used to represent your people, but also to keep track of different things like magic points and the number of turns you have left. These temple markers can be used to show dominance in the first round, but later on they actually stay on the board as temple markers, what they're intended to be. You also have a curse marker, which is only going to come into play during Phase 4, the war phase. Then you have the heroes and the hero and monster pieces, which again will only come into effect in Phase 4, the war phase. And these are only ever heroes and monsters. You can never mistake them for any other kind of piece. And the last type of component I'll show you is actually the most important thing, arguably throughout the game, and especially in the first phase, are the world tiles. Now, in each of these tiles, you have up to 4 different types of terrain. You have hills, mountains, forests, and plains. That's all. They're all indicated here, and they're all have along different edges of the tiles. During the first phase of the game, what you're actually trying to do is connect these tiles out on the board. Each player needs to put 10 tiles out onto the board in order to create the world that will be played in during the rest of the game. On your turn, you're going to draw 2 tiles from the stack. You can either play both of them, play one of them and discard the other, or dump both of them to draw another tile, and then you must play that one. You would do this if you just don't like the options you have on these tiles, because ultimately what you're trying to do is connect as many proper edges as possible. So let's just get in there and we'll take a look. So here we have mountains, forests, hills, and plains. So let's say that it was my turn and I've drawn these 2 tiles. So I'm going to play one tile out there. I've decided to keep the both that I have, so then I'll play that one. Then I want to try and connect this one as best as possible, which is not necessarily that easy, but I want to try to maximize my points as much as possible. So there, that's a pretty good connection there. So there I've connected 2 edges, and I've made 2 distinct squared off or squared off pieces of terrain. You see there's 4 distinct squares here for the mountains and the plains. You want to try to connect as many edges as possible, because that's how you're going to get the most points during the course of the round. But also, as you put out different world tiles, you also have the option of marking some of the squares or uncompleted squares of terrain with your temple markers. You're doing this because at the end of the round, whichever player has dominance over a particular type of terrain, so let's say I have the most of my temple markers in plains at the end of, in different squared off plains, at the end of the round, then I'm actually going to get bonus points for having done so. And I can put them on uncompleted pieces of terrain if I think that I want to block off my opponents from taking that terrain later when it is completed, because my opponent cannot claim a piece of terrain that I have already claimed with one of my temple markers. The other possible thing that could happen is that you can make lakes. This happens when you start building parts of terrain. Now, if the board ends up looking like this, then I have made a lake there in the center, and that's also going to lead to me potentially having a lot of different bonus points. So these are all the different types of things you can do with the tile placement. You're trying to connect as many edges as possible and claim as much of these regions as possible, the squared off regions, in order to vie for bonus points at the end of the round. Each player is going to place 10 tiles out, and once everyone has done that, then you move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is the population phase. The world is now built, and by the way, this is the world assuming that there are 4 players, so there's 10 tiles for each player. But this world is built, and now it is time to populate it with your followers. Players are going to take turns putting down their tribal markers around the board, and they're going to keep doing this, trying to put out as many of their markers as possible until one player runs out of all of their tribal markers, and then that's going to signal the final round of turns for this phase. Everyone has one last shot to put out their tribal markers, and then you'll be getting points throughout the whole phase, but at the end, if you are one of the players who managed to get rid of every one of your tribal markers, you'll actually get bonus points as well. Now, when you put out tribal markers, there's a couple of different ways in which you can do it. So let's just zoom in over here and take a look at the map, a closer look at the map. Whenever you put out tribal markers, the first thing you do is you choose an origin point. Then you have the option of either doing it in a cross pattern or a star pattern. So if I was to do it in a cross pattern, I would put out each of my tribal markers that I possibly can in a cross pattern like so. My other option instead is to do a star pattern, where you're connecting via the corners like this, remembering that every time you're putting your tribal markers into completed squares on the board. In fact, from now on, only completed squares on the board, not edges, are going to matter. Now, during this placement, remember, every player is going to be taking their turn placing out their markers. It is possible for more than one player to have markers in one spot, so that you can actually share territory with the other people in the game. However, there are limits on how you can actually place, or how many tokens one region can hold. Mountains can actually only hold 1 tribal token, forests can hold 2, hills can hold 2, and plains can actually hold 3. During the course of the round, you actually earn points for the numbers of different types of unique terrain that you place tribal tokens into with one of your placements. And then at the end of the round, as I briefly mentioned before, you actually get bonus points if you were able to run out of your own tribal tokens. Everyone else counts all the tribal tokens they have left, and then you get bonus points for how many of those tokens are left. Play continues in this manner until either one player has run out of tokens, or no one else can fill in any other spaces on the map. Then you move to phase 3. Now we get into phase 3 construction. So this is what the board's going to look like after phase 2. Everyone's has all of their different tribal followers out on the board. The goal here thematically is to have your tribes build temples in your honor. You're going to move around all these different tribes, running into other people's tribes and absorbing them and hopefully converting them over to your cause and then building one of your temple markers out onto the world. So let's go ahead and take a look at this part of the map over here just so I can show you an example of how this will work on someone's turn. Now when it's your turn in this phase, what you can do is pick up a stack of tribe tokens that are in one of the completed squares. As long as it has one of your tokens in it, you can pick it up. Then you're going to move it up to 3 times. Every time that you move onto a new square, you absorb essentially the tribal followers in that square. When the tribal stack gets up to 5, it immediately stops and then it turns into a temple. But that temple belongs to whoever has control of that stack, and that's whoever has a clear majority of the tribal tokens that are there. So in this stack that I just created, there are actually only 2 greens, 2 blues, and a red. So this is not an actual completed stack yet. Even though there's 5 of them, there's a tie for the most tokens. So no one has control of that stack yet, and then it can keep moving. If you have more movement points left of the 3, you can keep moving now. Otherwise, it just sits there until someone else comes along and absorbs it and tries to push you over the edge. But let's assume that that situation didn't happen, and let's go with this stack here. The blue player goes 1, 2, and then 3. So now there's 5 or more tribal markers in the stack, and blue is the dominant one here. There's 3 blue markers, so that immediately gets turned into a blue temple. And every marker every one of the tribal tokens that just got picked up and removed from the board is now a point for the blue player. You keep the tokens in front of you as well, because at the end of the round you get points depending on the number of enemy markers you were able to take. Specifically, the god who converted the most enemy tribal tokens of other players' colors, gets 10 extra bonus points. Also, if you move after you've made a temple, if you move a stack of tribe tokens into one of your own temples, they get removed from the board immediately. You don't just build another temple, and then you score. Also, let's say that you just move a stack of tribal tokens onto a temple that you've already built. It doesn't just turn into another temple, even if you have enough tokens. You just absorb or convert every one of those tribal tokens that's put onto your temple, and you score them as points immediately, and of course you still keep them in order to see if you have the most enemy tokens by the end of the round. This continues until every player has made 10 stack movements during the phase. Once everyone has done that, you'll add up your total score for the rounds, record it, and then move on to the final phase. And now we get to the final phase, the war phase. This is where the gods have built the world. They have inhabited it with their followers. They've had their followers build temples in their honor, and now they're going to war with the other gods. You'll notice at the start of this phase that only temples are out on the world. And I should say I made one small omission in the last phase, and that's that you cannot have built temples adjacent, even diagonally, to other people's temples. So this is a rough idea of what the board will look like during, or what the world map will look like during this phase of the game, with everyone's temples all scattered around the board. Now you're going to go into turn order, and you're going to be placing your adventurer, your hero and your monster down onto the board. Now in the beginning, very simply, you just get to summon next to one of your temples. Now once you've placed them out on the board, then you can move them. And your main goal with them, first off, with the monsters, you want to try and defile the enemy temples. If you move to an enemy temple, you can defile it by placing one of your tribal tokens onto it. Now it's considered defiled, and now the other players cannot summon their heroes and monsters onto that temple without spending magic points. You keep track of magic points with tribal tokens that you have left over from the other rounds. And of course, defiled temples are going to give you points at the end of the round and for endgame scoring. Now, both your heroes and your monsters can also attack other heroes and monsters. These are collectively called minions, by the way. So, let's say that here we have a few of the minions out on the board. Blue player goes. The blue player moves onto his opponent, his rival's monster, and gets to kill it. Now, when you kill one of the heroes or the monsters, they just go back to your player mat. They don't leave the game permanently. Instead, you just get to resummon them on your next turn, and the player gets to take one of your tribal tokens as a trophy, again, for endgame scoring. Now, the other neat thing that you can do on your turn is place, after you've finished moving your hero and your monster, is you can actually place one of these curse tokens onto one of your rival's temples. If you do that, that means that your rival can, whichever rival you target, cannot summon his hero and monsters from that temple. And so this is how play is going to proceed for 10 turns. Each player is going to have 10 turns to move their heroes and monsters around, take out enemy heroes and monsters, and get trophies as points, and also defile the temples of the other gods, also in order to get points, placing curses as they will in order to try and impede their rivals' movement and their war plans. And that is really Tyrannus. I know that's just a brief overview, but you're generally just trying to go through the different 4 phases, building the world, populating it, building temples in your honor, and then going to war with the other gods, collecting points in every single phase, collecting bonus points at the end of every one of those phases, keeping track of all of that, and then at the end of all 4 phases of play, whichever god has the most points, whatever player has the most points, is the winner of the game. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. There's a lot of very interesting things about Tyrannus. First off, it's got an interesting theme. Each player is taking control of this different god and trying to build up this world and then vie for supremacy in it. It actually reminds me a little bit of old video games like ActRaiser or just like Sim World or Sim Earth, where you're building all of this up and then competing against other players just to take control of it afterwards. So that's a very fascinating part of the game. Also, the fact that it's broken into these 4 very distinct phases, and each one is like its own smaller game. So in the first phase, you're simply building the world, you're creating the world, and you're doing this through tile placements. And then from that, it's leading directly into populating the world. So each phase thematically links to another one, and then mechanically what you do in one impacts the other, and setting yourself up beneficially in the beginning could really help you out later on, which is something unique that you don't see in a lot of different games, especially, again, because it feels like 4 distinct games that all link together. So you want to have, try to maximize your points in the beginning and build a world that's favorable to you. Then you go into populating it, putting out your tribes as best you can, setting yourself up for the construction phase where you can move your guys around using area control, another distinct mechanism, in order to build your temples in the best placement possible and try to put as many temples as you can out, because throughout all of the game, there's all these different things you can do if you can maximize your points. This is a point maximization game in a lot of different ways. So if you're able to put out all of your different tribes in the population phase, or if you're able to put out all of your temples and all of these different things you can do, even in the first phase, just putting out tiles in a very beneficial way in order to maximize your points there. This all is going to help you out later in the game. So maybe you stumble in one phase, but then you do better in another. Then you get all the way up to phase 4, which is completely different from the other phases, because now it's not just about building things, it's about potentially destroying things, defiling your opponent's temples. This is where there's interaction in each phase of the game, but probably not any more so more so in the 4th one. That's when the most of it is going to happen, because now you're directly in your opponent's faces, going for their temples, trying to take their heroes and monsters as trophies, again, in order to get as many points as possible. So it's just really, really interesting how all of these different phases interact with each other and build off of each other. This is a game about building in a lot of different ways, both thematically and mechanically, and it leads to a pretty unique experience that I haven't seen in a lot of other games, that's for sure. And if this is the type of game that interests you, if you've liked what you've seen here, I would urge you to go to the Kickstarter project page and find out even more information, and then consider backing the project. I'm going to have a link at the bottom of the screen, and then a link down in the comment section. That's going to take you directly to the Kickstarter project page, where you can find out more information about Tyrannus, Game of the Gods, from designer Thane Morgan. My name is Nick, this has been Board Game Brawl, and I'm reminding you to get out there and game every day, in every way. Take care.